Hello, little helpers. Welcome back. Today we are discussing my absolute favorite topic, which is narcissistic personality disorder. We've done an episode on this in the past. Feel free to go back and look, but today we are going to be talking about how to spot a narcissist. What are the signs of narcissistic personality disorder? And this may be more complicated than you thought because there are actually two types of narcissism delineated in the literature. One, the one we more typically think of is grandiosity. The grandiose narcissist, somebody who is attention-seeking, who is larger than life, who is assertive, confident, seductive. But there's also a lesser-known type called the vulnerable narcissist. And these people might be sneaking into our lives without us realizing it. So we want to pay special attention to these vulnerable types today. So, Kibby, why do you think narcissism is so popular these days? Why is it something that everybody is talking about?
Yeah, we're seeing that more and more. Our narcissistic personality disorder episode was really popular, and I read it over and over. Who's a narcissist? How to tell if your boss is a narcissist, your ex, your parents, right? Everyone likes to call each other narcissists, and I feel like people want to call others that when it's like that person doesn't pay attention to your feelings, right? Like if someone's selfish, we call them a narcissist. And I think it's becoming more popular now because there's all this research showing that the younger generations are more and more narcissistic over time, right? We're getting more and more narcissistic, especially in the US. With just the way our culture is set up, there's a lot of reinforcement of promoting your self-image on social media, making a brand out of yourself, becoming your own company and just selling you, right? There's a lot of emphasis on bringing attention to you as an individual and becoming famous in your own right? Like you've come from the reality TV world. Can you speak to that? Can you speak to like the emphasis on that?
I mean, totally. When I came off The Bachelor, it was a really angsty time because I had never been big into social media. I don't want to say, sorry. I was big into social media, but I was not big into self-promotion. And that doesn't mean that that's because I was a good person. It was because I had never had any opportunity to do that and I didn't know how to. And so I got a lot of advice about how to brand myself, which is an unusual undertaking. Like, how do I decide which qualities of mine are most aspirational and present them to others in a way that makes them want to follow me? Literally, we call them followers. What a strange proposal that is. I think this whole conversation is pretty interesting because, yeah, we are so tempted to call every ex of ours, whether it's an ex-boyfriend, girlfriend, ex-friend, ex-boss, a narcissist. It's tempting because it's a write-off. You know, oh, yeah, that person didn't treat me well because they're a bad person. I couldn't succeed at this company. I couldn't get ahead. I couldn't make them love me because they're a bad person. What chance did I have? And so it's really tempting. And I that's interesting too, because I do feel as if I've dated a narcissist or two, and they did feel like a different kind of human being. Like something was just shifted in their psychology in a way that would have made any kind of attempt at real human connection that was lasting and healthy impossible. And so I get the temptation because I've fallen for it. I've done it. But I also think in psychology, we tend to think of personality disorders more on a spectrum. And so it might be healthier to think of these things more as behaviors.
Yeah, and
as
I would
types.
say that narcissism is not bad in its own, right? If we're just going to define it, there's a lot of different definitions of narcissistic personality disorder, but narcissism itself is basically like a sense of specialness. You're special. You are entitled to special things. You're above others. You have markers of value that bring you higher on like a social hierarchy, right? So you think of yourself as a high social status, and like you very well could be, right? Having that sense of self-esteem of like, I am special could be really healthy. But I think where it tips into the disordered part is if you cling so hard, so rigidly onto that view of yourself that it doesn't reflect reality or cause problems in your life or hurts other people, right? Like I can feel like I'm special, but if I feel like I'm special, I need to put you down to maintain that feeling. That's the disordered part. And often this is to compensate for, like, people who are disordered with this have this sense of inferiority. Like they are actually not good enough inside from like childhood trauma or neglect or whatever. And then getting this like other type of specialness, like I am the most beautiful, I'm the most successful, I'm better at everyone, will compensate for that deep feeling of insecurity.
And it's funny because, and you see this especially with grandiose narcissism, we often tell people, fake it till you make it. If you're not confident, act like you are. And that's actually a pretty good idea, you know, because acting insecure, acting like a victim, which we see a lot in vulnerable narcissism, is not a particularly adaptive way to live life. Pretending like you're more confident than you are is. But again, it's this distinction between acting confident and tearing other people down in order to get a sense of undeserved confidence.
Right. So we'll kind of break up the vulnerable versus grandiose narcissism, because whenever you think of narcissists, at least I think of like Patrick Bateman from American Psycho, right? This like someone who dresses nicely, wants a lot of money, is like, it almost kind of like this shark, right? This want to beat down the opponents. They're the best. They're bragging. So and that's the grandiose version. Grandiose narcissism refers to people who are not modest, promote themselves, enhance their self-image, of course are entitled, and they're really antagonistic and almost aggressive to other people. So it kind of pairs with antisocial traits, which antisocial traits is like, I'm going to get to a goal no matter if I have to exploit or use or hurt other people. So it's almost like this kind of extreme aggression towards a goal and despite someone else, right? So that's why narcissistic and antisocial personality sort of kind of mixed together. So that's like the picture of this like grandiose narcissism, which is more of the classic version. Now, there's that, when we talk about this vulnerable narcissism, which is the flip, right? The idea is that people who have these really big personality disorders will flip between being grandiose and then vulnerable. Vulnerable looks like, if you think of like the guy who's bragging, but then the moments where he's hurt, it's like self-absorbed, entitled, and distrustful of others, but it has a little bit more of this victim flavor, right? Someone who's like more fragile, they're distressed, they're hurt, they're upset. They still have the part that's, you know, not nice to others, like feeling entitled and manipulative. They do it through this like this place of shame and victimhood, if that makes sense. Oh,
it makes complete sense because I've experienced this. I mean, this just really, well, yeah, I mean, it reminds me, first of all, of my grandmother, who I watched she was just a professional victim. Like, she would think of herself as such a good person. She was always doing things like, you know, charity works. Or one of my favorite things to do with her was like, we would take a shoebox and we would fill it with toys and we would send it to kids in Africa. And she would get this sense of, I don't know, she felt like a good person for doing that. And yet then we'd go home and she would be so evil to my grandfather, just completely tearing him down at the knees, just telling him he was an idiot because she was just in unbelievable contempt. And then every time, you know, she would do this thing. One of the reasons I traveled so much when I was young was because my grandparents, so neither of them went to college. They both worked at IBM. They worked really hard. They saved up. They only had one kid. And so they were fairly well off. But it was from a sense of like having worked their asses off to get there. And they would take us on these vacations and we would always know, we'd be so grateful for the vacation, but we'd always know it would be destroyed. It was kind of like is it really worth going to Vienna if we are going to somehow, some way offend my grandmother and have this massive fallout where she can't believe our behavior. She can't believe how ungrateful we are. that she's just been so hurt. And my mother would have to deal with this every single time and try to shield us from it. But it was remarkable every time, every holiday, whatever. So that's the first instance. But yeah, I do have an ex who I'm not going to call a vulnerable narcissist because I just don't want to. I don't want to start typecasting people because it's been done to me and he did it to me. But I would say that there was some serious vulnerably narcissistic behavior that involved slut shaming, making my past out to be something that victimized him in the present. A lot of distrust, a lot of, I do so much for you. How could you not follow my rules? A lot of, I am a good man and you make me feel like shit. Just a lot of martyrdom and victimhood. Yeah,
and I think that we wanted to do this episode because that is so hard to pick out as a narcissist because, with vulnerable narcissists, they're hidden. And to the point where I've seen in popular, writings these days in the media, it's also called covert narcissist. Because it's hidden in plain sight. It's not the person who's showing off. It's a person who's just so hurt and sad at, what you said, to the point where it's like almost like it's manipulating you into something, right? So, for example, like where did you, when in those interactions, like where did you feel the narcissism? Like, how did you know that was a narcissist versus someone who's just hurt?
I don't think I did. And it's still a question, but I mean, I think when I was with a grandiose narcissist, I felt like the pathetic one. I felt like I was always trying to get his attention.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
That I was never good enough. I was always trying to claw my way into his good graces. With the more vulnerable narcissistic behavior, I always felt like a bad person, like I was destroying my partner, and that who I was just threatening and, not abusive, but like that I needed to grow up, I needed to mature, I needed to be better, I needed to stop criticizing him, I needed to be more accepting, all of these things. And it was just, I just felt like there were so many times I considered breaking up with him because I was like, I don't think I'm good for you. I feel like I'm making you more unhappy being with me. And yet the response I would get is, no, you're the love of my life. I need you. I have never been more happy, but you do these things that upset me. It's like, okay, but you seem more than upset. You seem destroyed by this.
Yeah. That's a really good way of putting it. Like, you feel like the abuser. And hey, this is going to be hard to say, like, how to spot whether you're dating a vulnerable narcissist. Like, do you feel like an abuser? Well, that's a sign that they're, no, like, of course there are things that, both sides can do that are at fault. But I feel like when you're dating a vulnerable narcissist, you always feel like the abuser. And even if they hurt you, and if you try to say something about it, or just even have a conversation about that, you said this has hurt my feelings, or there's something I did that was not like intentionally hurtful, like when you would go on trips or something like that, and that person would act like you're the abuser every single time, and that strategy would lead to you changing your behavior or feeling controlled. That's where the vulnerable narcissist comes in, right? Like, I'll give my example with my ex, where definitely not grandiose in some ways, but when I was concerned about how he wasn't working, I would say like, hey, like, you said you would apply for a job. What happened to that? And you kind of collapse into the shame. Oh, I'm not good enough. I get so anxious. This is so hard for me. Can't you see it's so hard for me? And then I would feel horrible. I would be like, oh my God, like I'm abusing him by asking this question. Yeah. And the only way I could kind of reality check was to ask people like my friends, like you. It was like, here's the text messages, here's my conversation. Is this terrible? And people give me feedback that it was a normal thing to ask. But I constantly felt like the abuser, and what that would do is make me back off. Yeah. Make me, keep paying for things, keep like status quo, kind of lay off the questioning. But I would kind of like stuff it inside and be hurt and angry and confused, but his victimhood would control my behavior.
Yeah. I guess some examples I can give. Creating a narrative where, yeah, I'm the abusive one, and yet he would act in ways that were much more extreme than me, but they would get write-offs because I was the abuser. So creating this narrative where I was a flirtatious, likely to cheat partner, but then he was allowed to meet, quote, friends on 3 different dating apps. He was allowed to meet beautiful women on Instagram, FaceTime them in the middle of the night for many hours. He was allowed to start DMing my beautiful friends without me ever having introduced them and talking to them and saying, well, but I'm talking about how much I love you to these people. That's all I talk about. It's like, but I'm uncomfortable. These things make me uncomfortable. And then being like, but how? Because all I'm doing is just talking about my love for you. It's like, but wait, you're on dating apps? You're talking to my beautiful friends without my permission. You're talking to women in the middle of the night. But there's this narrative that I'm flirtatious, that and because I'm the way I am, you get to be this way.
Exactly. I think that's the thing. It's like you, if that person constantly does really hurtful things, like really almost maybe like consciously, like I know that this is going to hurt my partner. Like that ex was like, I know this hurts you, but I'm doing it in response to being hurt by you, right? So it kind of takes the accountability off of you. If I'm basically being abusive and mean to you, but I'm saying I'm doing it because you hurt me.
Yes.
It's like, no, that's a sign of abuse, but it's a sign of vulnerable narcissist, because what that does is completely minimize your feelings, right? And it completely puts accountability on you and takes all accountability off from him. A normal level of narcissism, let's say, is like, yeah, I did stuff that was bad. You did stuff that was bad. I'm sorry for the things I did, and you're sorry for the things you did, right? Like a balance of both people taking accountability for contributing to a crappy fight or situation. But if I'm constantly doing things that are mean to you and just say it's your fault. Yeah. That's gaslighting, but it's a vulnerable narcissist move, because it's keeping me special. It's keeping me in a place where my feelings are more important than yours. So, as I was trying to think about what are good examples of vulnerable narcissists, and it's tricky because they're really hidden, right? So, some good examples I thought of as, did you see the show Girls from HBO?
Did I see it? I love that show. It's one of my favorites.
Okay, this is actually going to age us, because if people listening don't know what we're talking about, we might be a little older or a different age category. But there's a really good character in the show named Desi, who becomes he's a musician and actor, and he marries Marnie, one of the main characters, and he's just a perfect example of a vulnerable narcissist. Like he brags sometimes, but he mostly is like this artist with a lot of pain, a lot of just a lot of sadness and sensitivity. So he comes across as emotionally sensitive. But if you watch all of his romantic relationships, he controls these women and does what he wants through acting like hurt and vulnerable and a victim.
He's truly a perfect example, because throughout their relationship, he wants her to be successful only as part of a duo with him. If she gets any success of her own, it's seen as threatening, if I recall correctly. And there's an amazing clip where she's like, I'm cruel for not wanting to get a scone with you. And he uses this sense of like, I'm so emotionally connected and with it, You're not. I'm going to make you feel like a cyborg and a bad person for rejecting my my play at emotional connection.
Yeah, and I understand that a lot of people can be emotional and sensitive and hurt, in many ways, and kind of wear their heart on their sleeve. But they do it in a way that Desi does it, where it just kind of sucks. It just kind of ignores the person in front of him and sucks them into whatever he wants.
Well, it's incredibly exaggerated, too. Like, she just didn't want to get a scone with him in that day, and he's calling her cruel. And,
Exactly. I'll put up a clip on our website and in the show notes where Marnie's breaking up with Desi, and you can just watch the vulnerable narcissistic tactics. And it's so brilliant because he cycles through them. in ways that make them so obvious that might have not been obvious while they were dating. So she goes, I want to break up with you. I want to be married to you. And then he goes, well, I don't think it's going to work out for you. You know so little of the world and you're going to get murdered. Yeah. And she deflects it. She goes, really? Okay, fine. And he starts crying and then goes, oh, okay, when you just remember the hope of the beginning. So he cycles through like attacking her and belittling her to get her to stay, and then goes into the victim. So you could kind of see these are not genuine emotions. They're just using victimhood to control her.
I remember when I did break up with this partner I've been talking about, it would cycle between, please give this another chance, we're so amazing together, I've never loved anybody more, to I would say no, and then it would be like, you're a narcissist, you're bad, you're not even capable of being sorry, I've always known this about you, no one's ever going to be able to accept you or love you, and then back, which are just like, you see those dynamics at play in this girl's episode. You will never be successful without me. So that's a devaluation, and then idealizing, remember the hope of the beginning. Yeah.
So we'll put that up in case anyone's like, wait, what are you talking about? Also, Girls is a great show, so if you haven't seen it, go watch it.
It's so fabulous. I think what this is getting at is it's really, Kibby and I are struggling this episode because we don't want it to seem like being anxious and having negative emotions and communicating those to your partner is abusive or narcissistic. That's not. It's when you use those things to control your partner and to punish your partner. When we have negative emotions, it's important to communicate those things and to ask your partner to maybe do something differently. But if you are saying, because I feel this way, then I get to punish you, I get to hurt you worse, maybe I do the same thing you did to me but 1,000 times worse, if I make you feel like, for doing something very minor, like not getting a scone with me, that you are a cruel, heartless person. And then I have a histrionic show of emotion. I mean, that's really unnerving.
Yeah, it's like if you watch Desi, you watch how his emotions swallow up everyone else's in the room. You gotta see, it's easier to see from the outside. It's really hard when you're inside because you're fighting and feel like you're hurting someone, so, but on the outside, when you watch someone swallow up really command the emotional stage all the time, that's a form of vulnerable narcissism.
I would say one thing to look out for is you can of course be upset with your partner and you can have an anxious attachment style. That does not mean that you have vulnerable narcissism. When you get upset, are you berating the other person? Are you insulting them? Are you making them feel small and scared? That's very different, Yeah, so one of the major differentiating factors between grandiose and vulnerable narcissism is that the vulnerable narcissist has what we call high trait neuroticism, which I think a lot of people are going to hear as like, when we call somebody neurotic, that we think of as like obsessive and anxious, but here we mean like high negative affect. So they might be prone to depression, prone to anxiety, just prone to negative feelings generally. The grandiose narcissist is not necessarily prone to any of that. In fact, the grandiose narcissist has very high self-esteem. That might be false. Like internally they're hiding a damaged sense of self, but they present as high self-esteem. They seem to believe that about themselves. The vulnerable narcissist has low self-esteem. And the point being here that if you have somebody in your life who makes everything about their negative feelings, like their negative feelings justify everything in the world, nothing is as important as how they feel because they feel so bad that you need to drop everything about you to attend to their bad feelings. Sometimes it's hard to tell because sometimes, people who are very depressed are often selfish because they're just trying to survive, and so, everything becomes about that negativity. But there's a kind of manipulation, I think, when it's like, you made me feel bad, therefore I'm going to make you feel worse. You made me feel bad, therefore I can insult you and I can do whatever I want.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, and you could hear how confusing this is to spot, right?
Yeah.
Like, I think if you're thinking of CEOs or politicians or whatever, it's very clear who's like bragging, right? Or big, larger than life. But now I feel like in our culture, there's just so much more emphasis on being seen and being special for it, like the attention to yourself, getting followers, getting likes, but also to be seen for like your victimhood, right?
Yes.
To be seen for the parts that are hurt. And yes, I totally, know what it's like to want to be seen for your pain. But if it gets to the point where you're seen for your pain and want to kind of usurp and overcome everyone else's, and like my pain is greater than yours, and I could do whatever I want because I'm so hurt, right? So you have to think about, again, like I'll kind of reiterate this over and over, pointing out narcissism is going to, the real core of it is the interpersonal antagonism. They're grandiose and entitled. They think they're special. And they're manipulating, right? They're manipulating you to do something. They tend to lie, right? And don't follow rules. Don't follow things that other people tend to do, right?
Yeah.
It just can look very different because this is what I think. Grandiosity is less in fashion now. Someone comes in and brags how amazing they are, especially if they're a white man. It's like, we're like, nope, that is not, we don't do that anymore. But if someone comes in being like submissive and hurt, we're much more likely to draw my attention to that person and like give them whatever they want. Right. So I think there's just like, what form would get that like entitlement in society now?
Yeah, I mean, it brings me back to this impact versus intent thing that I talked about in the ending engagement episode. It is such an interesting tactic to say that impact matters more than intent. The way that I wind up feeling because of whatever you did is what matters more than what you meant to do. What you meant to do doesn't matter at all. We don't even have to have a conversation about it. All that matters are my residual feelings. And like, that is such a dangerous path to walk. Because your feelings can be anything you want them to be. Entitled people feel entitled to huge reactions because that means they can have power over you.
Yeah. If it's used as a weapon of power and again getting over on someone else, that is like narcissistic in the bad way.
Yeah.
Right. There are plenty of people who think that they're special and are hurt and want attention from it. But if they do it to hurt other people or to manipulate others into like they get the power over them, that's the problem.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I guess I watch out for now is like somebody who tries to write the rules. Somebody who writes their own rules. I felt this with both the grandiose narcissist and the person who had vulnerable narcissistic behaviors. It's like they would create their own rules. They would act as though they were obvious, and the rules kept changing. There's no consistency to the rules. And so I was always wrong because I was always breaking a rule that they had just said. It's like, well, I can't play those games. Yeah. And again, you can see how this is becoming more and more common because what does our culture want? Like, I want to be a rule breaker. I want to, march to the beat of my own drum. I want attention to myself. I'm my own brand, right? There's a lot of good that comes from it. But when it becomes like this competition of like, if dealing with an ex or dealing with a partner, if you're hurt, then I'm more hurt and I'm going to wipe yours out. The competition for the attention can really be hurtful for the people around you. I feel like what at least I'm struggling with is differentiating vulnerable narcissism and that kind of behavior from feeling anxiously attached or from being in a negative place in your relationship. And I think the difference we want to highlight is that you can be depressed, anxious, anxiously attached, whatever, or your partner could be a real jerk and be doing things that are unacceptable. But are you using your negative emotions in order to control and punish the other person? And it's further difficult to disentangle those because negative emotions can be punishing to other people. Nobody likes to see another person cry. Unless they're my patient in a therapy session.
I think, it's about, you really have to look at how the patterns play out, right? You have to really look at these things over time and across different scenarios. So whenever we talk about, does someone have a personality disorder? Are they acting in ways that are problematic? You can't just look at the behavior itself and be like, yep, narcissist. You have to be like, is this person doing this over long periods of time? And are they doing it in multiple scenarios? So, for example, let's say you're dating someone, right? you hang out with an ex and your partner gets super upset and then yells at you and makes you and says like, I'll only be happy if you don't hang out with your ex. Okay. If that's the only instance, that could be like a conflict to work through, right? Yeah. And that's a relationship problem in and on of its own. Personality disorder behavior, or even like a narcissist, would do that, and then maybe do it with other things that you're doing, right? You can go hang out with a friend who's a girl. Same thing. I can't believe you did that. You hurt me. I don't care if you needed fun. You need to stay home more, right? And let's say they do it in all different areas of your relationship, right? And then they might do it in other relationships they've been in, and maybe even with some coworkers. Yeah. And maybe the goal is to have as many people as possible do what he or she wants, right? So I think when you really have to think about scope, like how extreme is this? Does it happen across time and across different contexts? That's every time we assess like disorder behavior. It's like, how often does this happen and where? Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I mean, again, it's normal. You're going to have conflicts, but if this is really generalized to other areas, then that's important to look out for. And yeah, I think this idea of like making your negative emotions the other person's responsibility, especially when it's hard when we talk about things that are relatively minor, because that's vague. What is minor? Is that minor to what something I consider minor be considered minor to another person? But you know, if you are not paying enough attention to them at a party or something, and they have a huge tantrum about this and freeze you out for 3 days, or use it as an excuse to insult you or be cruel to you, then that's not normal behavior. I think what's also common to the vulnerable narcissist is punishing the other person for receiving attention, for being happy and enthusiastic about something that isn't them.
I thought of another good example. Okay. If Ross from Friends, and again, this might date us, but I love Ross. He's my favorite character. But you could watch that in the beginning. He's very vulnerable, right? He's in the beginning of the series, he's left by his wife and he's very sad and the victim. And you can see that he's just kind of like mopey in every scene, and it all has to be about him. Like everyone's attention has to go to him. When he's dating Rachel and he's jealous that of coworker is flirting with her, he makes it all about him. He actually comes to her office, brings a bunch of flowers, gets in her way, makes it all about her, even though she is not flirting with this coworker and is trying to focus on her career. And they make a joke about it because more and more in the series, they kind of are more openly like he's a narcissist. He's very more grandiose and showy. But they also showed his family dynamics where his parents are obsessed with him and they completely ignore his sister Monica. So if you know Friends, you'll know what I'm talking about. Well,
first of all, it certainly says something about us that we've dated so many narcissists and we both consider Ross our favorite character.
We're gonna look at ourselves in those moments.
Seriously, there's something wrong. Maybe you guys should turn off this episode right now. Go listen to a different excerpt. So research is showing potential correlations between, it looks like, grandiose narcissism is maybe more associated with parents who actually overvalued the achievements of the child, kind of gave them like an inflated sense of self that wasn't really deserved. And so that's just the way they know. You know what I mean? That's just how they see themselves. They haven't been properly challenged. And vulnerable narcissism is more associated with invalidating, neglectful, abusive parents. And it's interesting, vulnerable narcissism is highly correlated with BPD. It looks like. Yeah. So those are two other constructs that need to be peeled apart, but wouldn't find it surprising to see vulnerably narcissistic behavior within a BPD individual. Borderline individuals are feeling very high negative emotions all the time, and it can be very hard to see past those when they're all consuming.
I think the red flags I've, read in the literature is like a lot of narcissists are very likable at first. Like all different types of vulnerable, grandiose, very likable at first, suck you in, make you think, wow, this person's really special, right? This kind of like this draw. But then after a while of getting to know them, there's problems, a lot of conflict, a lot of feeling like dismissed, overlooked, gaslit, right? And I think like anecdotally, when you notice that this person hasn't maintained a lot of really healthy long-term relationships, like hops from job to job, needs like a new set of friends every so often, right? Like you could kind of, that's the all personality disorders. Like when you notice that someone can't maintain a relationship that's healthy for long periods of time, that's like kind of a red flag.
Yeah. Right. I also think it's a red flag when you ask them about their relationship failures and it's all about how the other person failed them, right. How they just have a string of evil people in their lives who failed them, like that's, yeah. I do want to bring in a follower story because I thought this was very familiar to me, and this is basically a story of a woman whose past sex life was used against her. And this is something that happened to me as well. So she said when we first met, he did basic love bombing. She pushed back on this a bit. He did not show signs of grandiosity. So she kind of took note of this love bombing, but didn't think of it as a major red flag, which is exactly what we're talking about. These people are so hard to spot. He had a difficult past. He viewed these past hardships as if the world had conspired against him, and then he would weaponize them. For example, I didn't take him home for the holidays because she thought it was too soon, and melted down about how cruel I was for denying him from spending time with family when he was all alone in the world. Okay, so he's making his problems and his negative worldview her problem and saying that she is a conspirator, just like everyone else. She said that he and I had different values around sex. He viewed it as something to be only shared with a select few. This is so interesting to me because it was the same with this ex that I'm talking about. It's kind of this virtuous view of sex. It should be extremely special. That's a perfectly fine outlook to have. But when you then use it to shame the other person, especially into shaming them to comply with your sexual wishes, that's not about making it special or intimate. That's about control. So she said when we would go places, he would many times ask, have you slept with anyone here? He knew I had a relationship with a neighbor in my building and shamed me a lot for sleeping with him. He also wouldn't come to my building. He wouldn't eat Indian food with me. So she told him a story about this neighbor that she slept with and her eating Indian food together. And so he just cut out the entire experience. Wow. I wasn't able to even post Instagram photos that someone I had slept with had taken of me, even though this person wasn't in them, because it was a reminder of someone that had touched me. He shamed her a lot for her sexual past. He was incredibly insecure and possessive. She'd go away with friends on trips and he would ignore her and later tell her that he didn't miss her. And then he'd talk about how much fun he had without her and all the women that hit on him. So again, shaming her for her sexual past and then doing, the opposite. And then this is a story about how sensitive he was. So the night before my birthday, we were having sex and he wouldn't look at me or face me. After a few requests for him to look at me, I rolled my eyes. After we talked about why I had rolled my eyes and just had a multiple long-hour fight about this, he couldn't believe that I would ever say anything in any way critical about sex. He maintained that he was better than anyone I'd ever been with. He shamed me for wanting to enjoy sex. I wanted to sleep and he wouldn't let it go. After that day, we had sex much less regularly. He said that I had ruined it for him and it would take years for him to feel confident again. I love that last line. She has destroyed sex for him for years. What a victim.
Well, thank you, follower, for sharing that with us. And we're here for you. But it's interesting as you're reading that out. I'm just thinking about how when we talk about narcissism and its emphasis on feeling entitled, right? You're special. It's interesting how feeling special is needed in even areas of intimacy, right? Like I want to feel special in a narcissist in like professional settings. I want a lot of money or whatever. But if your primary sign of value is intimacy, like can I have all of this person's intimacy? I don't even want them to have any intimacy with people in the past or anything outside of me. It has to be all about me. That's just so interesting because, like, in a way, you're like, wait a minute, isn't that what a relationship is like this special intimacy? But if it's used to make the other person feel bad or to, like, you know, destroy their self-esteem or make them feel small, that's the problem, right? That's an NPD.
Well, yeah, and research has shown that vulnerable narcissism is associated with anxious attachment styles, and it's associated with using sex as a proxy for intimacy. Now, that does not mean that sex shouldn't be considered a form of intimacy, but this could mean demanding sex of your partner as the way to have intimacy, even when your partner is not having an intimate experience with you. So, you know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
And so then it feels like you're using my body to feel a sense of connection that isn't even real because I am not connected with you. I feel used by you. I don't feel turned on, but this is something I have to get you or give you. Otherwise, I'm going to be blamed for withholding connection.
Oof. That's brutal to hear. Like, I can imagine that just could be so devastating for the other side.
Yeah, right? I mean, I lived that.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. What did that feel like? What did that feel like to hear or to experience? I
mean, I you know, I've experienced this from multiple men. So it's not that it felt like a slow wearing down of my sexual agency and enjoyment. Because it was not about making me feel safe or intimate. It was about extracting confidence from me and guilting me into providing this without any real desire on my part. And a lack of desire on my part was seen as immensely shaming. And the difficulty is I would also feel ashamed and hurt if someone rejected me sexually. Mm-hmm. So I got it. I totally got that. But it's like when it starts to feel like an obligation, and this happens in marriages all the time, you know, when it starts to feel like an obligation, the connection is stripped away from it because it's not connecting anymore. You haven't been seduced. You're not sharing an experience of playfulness. You are giving something because the other person says that they need it and guilts you into it. So how would you differentiate between asking your partner for something versus being demanding and controlling?
I think it's what they're asking for and how. I think that if someone is taking accountability and says, I feel hurt by this and I'm asking you if you would be okay, let's say, not hanging out with an ex or not hanging out with these friends and stay home with me because I really missed you, right? Mm-hmm. A lot of that content that I said hopefully takes accountability from my feelings and is making a request that you could say no to, right?
Yeah.
So it's the approach of someone coming to you like two equals.
Yeah.
Now, someone who's more vulnerably narcissistic ultimately doesn't see him or herself as equal to you, whether they're seeing this always as a competition of who has the power here, right? And so even their approach might be different. It's going to be more, probably more indirect, in line with my manipulation. Like, oh, fine, you can go out and see your friends, but it's clear that you don't care about me and just going to leave me at home and, like, why do I even bother with you? Why do if you're just going to hurt me this badly, right? Yeah. So it's bringing in all the attention all to you, to the vulnerable narcissist, and it's not actually making a request. It's basically getting you to feel so guilty that you do what he or she wants. And I think that moments where, moments that I questioned your relationship, if you don't mind me sharing this, but the moments where I felt like you were starting to be more controlled was when you would share that you felt stuck or you felt you have to make yourself smaller in order to avoid hurting him. And I understand we've talked about this a lot in this podcast about there are things that you like to do that could be scary or hurtful for your partner, like that you like having male friends.
Yeah.
Okay. But if it's to the point where you feel like as a person you had to limit all of your freedom and choices and values in order to make that person feel like to not explode at you. I feel like that's where that's the difference between making requests and actually controlling that person. Does that make sense? Or
it does. It does. I think there can be a differentiation here also between like asking somebody to do something versus attacking their character until they feel like they have no choice but to not do the thing.
Right. You see that they're trying to get what they want through belittling you and making you feel worse about yourself. Yeah. Versus just asking you and saying, hey, do you mind not hanging out with that person? It makes me really uncomfortable. What do you think?
Yeah. It also feels like you're in a constant kind of battleground. Like if you ask for something, you know that in return you might be controlled for something. So this is another relationship. This person did a lot of recreational drugs. And I basically said, can you please cut down your use of this? I don't like your behavior on this particular drug. And they said, well, you do drugs. You take medications. So if I have to quit doing drugs, you have to quit taking medication.
Right.
Which is just a sort of an absurd proposition. But again, it's a refusal to... It's a refusal to give up any power, or it's seeing that ask of mine as an attempt to control and disempower him, and so then he must control and disempower me.
Right.
Instead of seeing my ask as we would be actually more connected if this behavior would change.
Right.
It's hurting our relationship.
Right.
Yeah.
Like look at that example. It's very subtle and it's a really good one. Instead of him, just talking as equals, like, okay, let's talk about what upsets you about it. How can I cut down? Let's work together. It's, if you're going to ask me to give up my freedoms, I'm going to ask you to stop taking your prescribed medications, knowing that you can't, knowing that would actually be really harmful for you. And then you would basically have to say no to that request or do something that's harmful for you in order to appease him. Yeah. So that's a really good example. Really subtle, right? Because it on the surface, it's like, if everyone's compromising, that's part of relationships. But no, see how that basically puts you in the checkmate. That puts you in a cage and you can't do anything except do whatever it takes to make him feel better, which is to drop the whole thing. Yeah. I think again, I just said this, but if you feel like your relationship is about power, then you are likely not in the right relationship. We can call that vulnerable narcissism. We can call that any kind of narcissism or just control or abusive. But I think that's because it's an indicator that the person is going to experience every ask that you have as shaming and disempowering. And they're going to maybe lash out. Right. That's a key part of narcissistic personality disorder. Being unable to take criticisms because criticisms to them feel like you are criticizing their entire value as a human being. Whereas a lot of us can take criticism and it will hurt, but they could still be like, well, okay, I got to get better at this, even though I'm a worthy person. I think what's interesting is that the power dynamic in a relationship with somebody who's vulnerably narcissistic is very confusing because since they have such strong negative affect and insecurity, they can make you feel like the one with the power. Exactly. Or the idealized one. Yeah. So in a way you feel at the top of the power hierarchy, but the actual behaviors put you at the bottom because... Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. It was really hard for me to see in my own relationship I was talking about because I would be the one like paying for everything, but I would be the one coming to him being like, what's going on with your job applications? And then we go into the cycle where I would basically like, he would be ashamed or, sad or feel like a victim of something. And I would back off. And I felt like I was like, the one with all the power and almost like abusing someone. But then when I noticed, I felt like helpless. I think that's a feeling that signaled me that I felt like the power dynamic is not what it seemed. When I felt like helpless and I felt like I'm the one who just has to have to do something to avoid more problems, I felt locked. I felt like I almost walking on eggshells. I couldn't move in any direction without me being afraid of some repercussions.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, that eggshell feeling was there when I dated that grandiose narcissist, but I definitely felt at the bottom of that power hierarchy. I mean, there was no mistake.
Right.
He had all of the power.
Right. And both narcissists, grandiose and vulnerable, often will flip between the two different kinds, right?
And
there's
that's
not just like
interesting,
one
too.
versus the other. It's like even grandiose people would have that softer, like shame-prone side underneath.
Yeah, it was interesting too because it's, you know, you read about the vulnerable narcissist, it says they're shy, introverted. And I was like, well, that was sometimes the case, but other times very extroverted, very aggressive, assertive. And that was always confusing. What I felt was that he was a Jekyll and Hyde type character. And I think what made this so painful and distressing and confusing was that Dr. Jekyll was wonderful, very sweet, very connected, you know, very lovable. But then this Hyde character would come and it was just like, I was like, I don't recognize the humanity in this person. I cannot figure out what's going on. The behavior doesn't kind of follow the normal rules of like human logic. And I'm getting massively insulted. I mean, once I made a joke during a comedy set that so it was basically a comedy sketch about like something about men liking virgins. And he had dated a virgin in his past. And so I kind of poked him. I was like, it's like you. And for ribbing him like that, he later said, yeah, well, you had sex with men for money. I was like, what?
Which is not true, by the way, listeners. I know her very well. It's not true.
Yeah, he was like, yeah, you dated wealthy men just for their money. I was like, no, I didn't. I did date wealthy men. It's not just for their money. And what the fuck? Even if I had, why would you throw that in my face? Like, why would you insinuate that your own partner was a prostitute because she ribbed you about dating a virgin in the past?
Right.
It's just, because he felt shame for some reason about this, then he got to call me prostitute.
Right. And just so we could get a picture of it, if a non-narcissistic behavior would look like this, like, hey, Jacqueline, that was a really hurtful thing you said. Like, I feel like you were making fun of me and it made me feel really ashamed. And, you know, like I've really, you know, this is the way I feel about it. I just want to let you know because you really hurt my feelings. I would like an apology, or I'd like you to understand this part about me. Right. Not like, now I'm going to say something mean about you to make you feel bad so that, and that's in response to how you made me feel bad. You hurt me so I can hurt you. Yeah. Right.
Always looking for opportunities for retribution. I think it can be very confusing for the person who's been with somebody who demonstrates these traits, because there were probably, I think we always, back to what we were talking about in the beginning, we always want to know, like, is this person in the monster class? Did I just stumble upon a monster? And it's like, probably not. Probably you stumbled across somebody with really complicated psychology who sometimes acts out in these really shitty ways. And it might be inflexible and it might not be fixable on a timeline that's reasonable for you. But yeah, they had other good things too. They had moments that were sincere and human and loving. And I think that can really fuck with people.
Yeah, and also to be really fair to people who are victims of abuse or have PTSD, people who have been abused in their past often will hurt other people in their present, right? Like, and you know, a lot of people who come in seeking treatment for trauma will often do things to hurt others, whether they mean to or not. And if you've been a victim of something in the past, it's a really big feeling of powerlessness, right? Like, let's say I was a victim of sexual assault. I'll feel so powerless in that moment that I might try to look for power in other ways in my present, in ways that might be not direct. It might be like, you know, a little bit manipulative or a little tough. So it's really getting tricky here to kind of point out, like, you're a monster and you're not. Even vulnerable narcissists have legitimate reasons for being hurt. And they do need compassion. They do need love. They do need to be healed, but just maybe not in the way of using like manipulation to get others to do what they need.
Yeah. And also people behave poorly all the time. I think the real question is this persistent?
Yeah, right. Good
This
point.
is keep showing up all the time, and it's just destroying your self-esteem or your happiness, or you're feeling like a bad person. I mean, God, how many times have I sat on this podcast being like, am I a narcissist? Am I broken? Is it, is everything my fault in all these areas of life? And it's, because of past experiences and having been told, like, I'm a bad person and I'm lucky to be loved by him. And
Yeah, to be fair, everyone is a little bit narcissistic, right? I'm a narcissist is kind of a stupid question because all of us have traits of narcissism. All of us want to be special. All of us want to feel better than someone else. All of us want to present themselves in a way that gets attention. Okay, that's a normal thing. Again, are you hurting other people because of it? Then you got to look at yourself. And I like the persistent point because there's research to show that vulnerable narcissists tend to use more defensive tactics, whereas like in conflicts, grandiose people use more like assertive tactics against other people, like intimidating them, right? Or like going after them, belittling them, right? Being like larger than life, kind of like aggressive. Vulnerable narcissists would use defensive tactics more. So excuses and justifications that discredit negative images of them. So for example, if someone goes, hey, vulnerable narcissist, you did this thing that really hurt my feelings. They'd be like, no, I'm not the bad guy in this situation. I only did what I did because you hurt me. I was just acting out of pain, but I didn't mean anything bad. I didn't hurt anyone at all. I'm the good guy here. Or, so there's like a way to like, excuse your own bad behavior, or you're setting expectations low. You're self-handicapping, or you're giving a lot of disclaimers. So a lot of what that would look like is if they feel like, for example, they can't get the job that they want, the best CEO, I own a company, like the high special job that they feel like they deserve, they won't even try. Yeah. They will not work. They will live off someone else. They will be like, oh, things are so hard for me, right? But if it's something that's persistent, like you said, like everyone uses this, but if they use this all the time, and don't take accountability for their own actions, and also recognize your feelings and needs too, narcissists. Or like, how about this? Disordered narcissistic behavior.
Yeah, right. I really think it's probably better to look for this behavior rather than the narcissist. These are all signs of maybe they're a narcissist, but you don't need to get that far. You don't need to categorize someone to be able to say, this is behavior that is not going to work in a relationship or a friendship of any kind. Yeah. Like, I can't handle someone who hurts me because I hurt them. Or who... and like some of this behavior, like, I give disclaimers about work. I'm like, I'm probably going to suck at this. I'm really sorry. You're probably going to be frustrated with me. And it's because I'm insecure. Like, so if this person has this pattern of doing all of these things because of insecurity, like, it sucks that they're insecure, but that doesn't excuse the behavior and mean that they're a healthy person to be friends with. We can excuse these things to a degree, but...
Yeah. And if you're sitting here wondering, I'm sure a lot of people are listening to this being like, oh my God, I think I'm in a relationship with a narcissist, right? Like, and I have to say, like, if you're the kind of person who tends to give your attention or give the power to other people a lot, it can be really hard to tell, right? Like, if you're there, like, having sex, like, discrediting your own feelings and just giving that other person everything, then, and you're that kind of person, it's just hard to tell, like, who's the monster, as you're saying. So just wipe that, like, is he a narcissist or she is a narcissist or not? Wipe that out. But you could probably think to yourself, like, okay, when I assert my needs or feelings to that person, even if it's, like, not popular with them, right? Even if they not like it, what do they do with that? If you feel like, oh, no, actually, I feel comfortable kind of being open, being myself, asking them what I need, expressing what I feel, expressing what I need in most situations. Great, right? If you feel like you can never do that, right?
If you'll be met with insults.
Yeah. And if you feel like you can never do that because it's horribly punished, right? If I say what I really feel, if I assert my needs, if I say no, if I tell them that something they're doing is hurting my feelings, they're going to come back with something, with either like an attack or a defensive tactic, or collapse into shame or a negative emotion that draws the whole attention to them, right?
Yeah.
If they make it all about them, that's more of a sign of narcissistic behavior if it happens a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I think being on the constant lookout for shame is kind of an indicator. Like, all of us hate feeling shamed. It sucks. It's supposed to suck. That's the whole point of the emotion, because it tells you to stop doing bad shit. But if you are living under the shadow of shame all the time, because anything you say, like if you have to look for the exact right mood that the other person is in to set a boundary, to say a need, it's just not going to be a good relationship for you. Because they need to enhance their own sense of self-esteem and solidity before they can meet your needs. You can't do that for them.
Yeah, when that bottomless pit feeling is around, right? If they're like constantly looking for validation and looking for attention, admiration, or whatever they need, and it never feels like enough, that's another sign for me.
If you feel like you are destroying their self-esteem, but you're not trying to, that's probably a sign. Yeah. Because either way, I mean, it's interesting, like you might be made to feel like you are hurting them so badly. You're destroying their self-esteem, and yet they still want to be with you. It's like, well, why? I don't want to hurt you. Why would I keep hurting you? And so it's a choice between breaking their heart or breaking their confidence. Like that, that's not sustainable. That's not a good choice.
Yeah. Also, look at, like, if you are actually doing abusive behavior, you reflect on your own behavior and seeing if you tend to be hurting others. But if that person's the only one, right? Yeah, exactly. Like, but if that person's the only one who acts like you're the abuser, right? Well,
yeah, I mean, God, we could go in circles with this topic because, I mean, I don't want to encourage people to not look at their own behavior and say, oh, I'm hurting this person. It must be that they're the victim. Sometimes they are a fucking victim.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's where the are they a monster question comes in. If you're constantly trying to look for, are they a narcissist? You're automatically just trying to paint them as a monster and you as like the pure one. It's way more complicated than that. Right? Yeah. We started out by how do we spot a narcissist, but it's a little bit more like how do we identify narcissistic behavior in other people and yourself. And remember, again and again, it's all about this antagonism. Is there deceitfulness? Is there manipulation? Is there a sense that one person is more special than everyone else? Are people being hurt by this? Yeah. That's the sign.
And I guess the last thing that I have to say is if you end a relationship with this person, or maybe the relationship isn't going well and you feel this intense pain and guilt, that might be part of this system. I mean, because when somebody's negative emotions hold you captive and become the most important element in the room, then you are going to feel really guilty for making them feel worse. And you're going to feel like you're not allowed to make them feel worse because that would be so terrible. But ultimately, they're another adult individual and they are responsible for their own feelings. Their feelings are not your feelings. They're not your responsibility. They need to be able to manage themselves. They need to be able to set their own boundaries, take care of themselves, make adult decisions. And their inability to do that is not your fault.
I think that well said. I think it's like everyone should be able to take accountability for their own actions and their own feelings. And if you feel like there's a power dynamic that's like one person has all the power and not, who knows which one's a narcissist, but it's like there shouldn't be a huge power dynamic. One person's a special one and the other person isn't. That you should look into that as some kind of narcissistic behavior somewhere.
All right. So Kibby, close us out with some resources.
Yeah, in preparing for this episode, I just loved actually delving into the research about it because there's so much pop culture about it. But I think it's just becoming, when people write about it in pop culture, is becoming a lot more just like is this a bad person? Who's a narcissist? Everyone's a narcissist. So if you really want to dig into these topics from the science, a really good paper is called Controversies in Narcissism by Joshua Miller and colleagues. I'll link that paper onto the website. And another thing I'll link to is there's a scale that actually measures vulnerable narcissism. It's called the Hypersensitive Narcissism Scale. So I'll put a link up on our site that allows you to click on it and actually take the scale. So you could fill it out for yourself, or you could fill it out on behalf of someone else, and just to play around and just to say like, oh wait, there was a narcissism in front of my eyes.
Totally. There's also the Narcissistic Personality Inventory, which is a very commonly used assessment for narcissism. I got a 15 on it, which is in the normal range. Especially for reality TV stars, so slightly elevated, but still a normal range. And that's another thing you can take. All right, guys. Well, gosh, I have some really negative emotions whenever you don't rate, review, and subscribe, and I feel pretty entitled to having you do that. So please go ahead and rate, review, and subscribe.
Pay attention to us and validate us.
Pay attention to us and validate us. It's your fault I feel this way, and we'll see you next week. By accessing this podcast, I acknowledge that the hosts of this podcast make no warranty, guarantee, or representation as to the accuracy or sufficiency of the information featured in this podcast. The information, opinions, and recommendations presented in this podcast are for general information only, and any reliance on the information provided in this podcast is done at your own risk. This podcast and any and all content or services available on or through this podcast are provided for general, non-commercial informational purposes only and do not constitute the practice of medical or any other professional judgment, advice, diagnosis, or treatment, and should not be considered or used as a substitute for the independent professional judgment, advice, diagnosis, or treatment of a duly licensed and qualified healthcare provider. In case of a medical emergency, you should immediately call 911. The hosts do not endorse, approve, recommend, or certify any information, product, process, service, or organization presented or mentioned in this podcast, and information from this podcast should not be referenced in any way to imply such approval or endorsement.